Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you...
Hey there, welcome to Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, the Guided by Voices podcast. Every GBV LP, every 2 weeks. I'm Jeff Gomez, and today I'll be talking about 2001's Isolation Drills. But first, as always, all music heard in this podcast is played and owned by Guided by Voices. Any reviews or materials cited are owned by their respective creators. And of course, I couldn't do this without Jeff Warren's Guided by Voices database, located at gbvdb.com. Subscribe to future episodes or listen to past episodes at everygbvlp.com. And if you'd like to drop me a line, send an email to jeff@everygbvlp.com. And real quick, I want to mention my new novel, Losing Our Edge. It's a sequel to 2 books I wrote about Generation X in the 90s. Check it out at losingouredge.com. One more thing, next week I'll have another bonus episode. This week I'll be talking to Adam Shore, the A&R man who signed the band to TVT Records. We'll talk about Do the Collapse, Isolation Drills, getting kicked out of the Pine Club, and much more, so check it out. Now let's get to the show. Okay, we're now a dozen records in. We're also at the start of a new decade. The previous decade, the 90s, had been huge for GBV. They rose from obscurity and conquered the indie rock world. They produced a bona fide masterpiece, B-1000 or Alien Lanes, depending on your point of view. They signed a 6-figure deal and toured the world. Plus, they appeared often on MTV. It'd been an amazing ride for a bunch of drinking buddies from Dayton. However, by the end of the 90s, things were starting to slip. The band's previous LP, 1999's Do the Collapse, saw the band leave indie cred powerhouse Matador for the much larger but also less cool TVT Records. They made a slick commercial record with a big-name producer and toured longer and harder than they ever had before. However, the results didn't bear as much fruit as the band or the label had hoped. Sure, GBV sold more records than they ever had, but not by much. The band's big breakthrough didn't happen. You could picture them big time, but that was about it. Even worse, the strain of trying to get to that next level led to the ruin of Pollard's marriage of 2 decades, and this sent him into a depression. As he said later, life is a series of mistakes. You have to learn from them, and you can't dwell on them or condemn yourself. The biggest mistake I made was cheating on my wife while I was on the road. I didn't do that for 6 years, but finally succumbed, and it cost me everything, including my happiness. That's heavy stuff, especially for a guy known for high kicks and good times. GBV was in many ways a party band, and the party was taking a turn for the worse. Everything Pollard went through during this period bled into the music and lyrics he was writing, and it all fueled and enhanced GBV's 12th record, Isolation Drills, making for some of Bob's most poignant lyrics and one of the band's best records. But Bob wasn't the only one going through hard times. At the end of the century, the recording industry, the one Pollard had tried for so long to break into, was itself in a downward spiral. The introduction of the internet, along with Napster, was beginning to change everything. The web allowed music fans to trade their catalogs with both their friends and strangers for free and almost instantaneously. At its height, Napster had 80 million registered users, and its growth sent shockwaves throughout the music industry. The heyday of the CD was over. People were getting everything digitally, and that usually meant for free. A whole new generation saw records and songs as something that you didn't have to pay for. And by the time iTunes launched in 2003, this behavior was pretty much ingrained. According to CNNMoney.com, from 1999 to 2009, the revenue in the U.S. from music sales was cut in half, going from $14.6 billion to $6.3 billion. And when people did spend money on music, it was usually to buy a single rather than the entire record. In fact, from 2000 to 2014, album sales tanked by 86%, while the sale of singles increased by 718%. And in terms of the scenes that Pollard had been associated with, whether it was lo-fi or indie rock or even alternative, all 3 of those had lost steam by the end of the decade. 120 Minutes, the MTV show that had featured GBV and played a big part in their exposure, had gone off the air to make way for reality shows like The Real World. Grunge was a completely spent entity, as was Britpop. Magazines like Alternative Press and radio stations like K-Rock in Los Angeles went from profiling and playing alternative artists like Beck and the Breeders to featuring nu metal or emo bands like Stained and Blink-182. Radiohead, who'd produced one of the best records of the 90s with OK Computer, returned in the new decade with a pair of LPs that largely replaced guitars with electronic textures. They might have been pointing the way forward, but it wasn't much fun. And while bands like the White Stripes and the Strokes would soon lead a rock revival, that was still a few years away. What did all this mean for GBV? Well, it wasn't good. The world that Bob had always wanted to break into just didn't exist anymore. Maybe if their records of this period, Do the Collapse or Isolation Drills, had come out in '95, pre-internet, pre-Napster, when Alternative Nation was still a thing, maybe they would have been more successful than they were. GBV probably would have had a few hits. After all, if the Flaming Lips could do it, why not Guided by Voices? And maybe if they had, they'd be spoken of today in the same breath as the Pixies or Weezer, two bands who, despite some rocky steps and bad records, have managed to, more or less, prolong into the future decades the status they held in the 90s. Instead, GBV's still, 30 years after their first record, a cult band. Which, in the end, is probably okay, since the closer Pollard came to breaking through, as well as just plain seeing what it would take to do so, the less he liked it. He hated playing the third stage at festivals at 11 in the morning. He hated waking up early to do in-stores or talk to a radio station. And he hated it when his label told him an LP lacked singles or chided him for holding out on them. They wanted hits, but Bob did too, and he thought he was supplying them, but nothing really stuck. Reality was beginning to set in, Pollard saying, "I've come to the conclusion that maybe we're not capable of having a hit. We're just not that kind of band." It was a sober assessment coming from a guy who was known for always having a beer in his hand. Isolation Drills didn't come out till 2001, while Do the Collapse came out in 1999. This meant that the year 2000 was one of the few years where GBV didn't release any new material. However, Bob did release 2 records by 2 new side projects as part of his Fading Captain series, an LP from Hazard Hot Rods, Big Trouble, and Speed Traps for the Bee Kingdom by Howling Wolf Orchestra. Both of these efforts are pretty tossed off, even for Bob. The Hazard Hot Rods album was recorded live in a video store in 1990 on a boombox. It was basically just Tobin and Pollard and Mitch, along with someone named Larry Keller on drums. They improvised songs based on the movies they saw around them, which you can tell from the titles. They must have been near the Alfred Hitchcock section, since 3 of the British film director's movies are referenced: 39 Steps, Sabotage, and The Man Who Knew Too Much, a film Hitchcock actually made twice. It's not at all a great record, and you have to wonder, if Bob really wanted GBV to be successful, why did he give any time at all to side projects like this? The year 2000 also saw the release of the first Suitcase box set, Failed Experiments and Trashed Aircraft. Pollard had long talked about having a suitcase full of songs, and with this release he proved to the world, not that there was much doubt, that he indeed had a mountain of songs just sitting around in his basement. It was originally rumored to be a 10 CD set, but by the time it arrived, Pollard had culled it down to 4 CDs, 25 tracks per. The 100 songs span the entire history of the band, some of them predating even GBV. They range from alternate versions of songs that had already been released to unheard gems or album outtakes. Another unique feature of the box set is that Bob attributed each song to a different fictional group. At one time, Pollard was thinking of writing a book of band names, but he ran out of steam after coming up with 100 or so names. He puts them to good use here. There are some real classics, among them Huge on Pluto, Judas and the Pile Drivers, Ceramic Cock Einstein, Arthur Psycho and the Trippy Warts, and Royal Japanese Daycare, just to name a few. At least one of these names would be revived for later releases, Rickard Wiki going on to release 3 full-length LPs and a number of singles in 2015. Pitchfork, in a 7.9 review, wrote that Suitcase is crammed with classic Pollard moments, those unique occasions where poorly recorded, sloppily delivered songs somehow become transcendent pop genius. Less charitably, the AV Club called it a must-only for the hardest of the hardcore Pollard fans. It would be the first of 4 installments of the Suitcase series. When GBV went into the studio to record their new LP, the band had 2 new members. Doug Gillard and Jim McPherson were back on guitar and drums, although McPherson would leave the group right after recording the record in order to spend more time at home with his family. The new members were Nate Farley on guitar and Tim Tobias on bass. Both of them had strong ties to the band. Remember that Nate Farley was the roadie who'd saved the day a few years prior when Tobin Sprout had to bail on a West Coast tour to be with his wife, who was giving birth. A Dayton local, he had also been in the short-lived Kim Deal band, The Amps, along with McPherson. Tobias had been in Doug Gillard's previous band, Gem, not to mention a group called Four Coyotes, who'd released a few 7-inches on Scat. Tim's brother is, of course, Todd Tobias, the producer and multi-instrumentalist who would go on to co-produce the next 3 GBV records. Todd also produced and provided the backing tracks for a number of truly stellar Pollard solo records, not to mention he's the creative force behind the side project Circus Devils. Circus Devils released 14 records of fractured, Devo-inspired weirdness before calling it quits in 2017. Pollard said of his new lineup, "Technically, we're the best we've ever been." However, he also admitted that they were a bad influence on him. "I can't fucking hang with them," he said. "I at least know when to go home and go to bed." Things were getting out of hand, even for GBV. To help right the ship, Bob called the band meeting and told the guys to tone down their partying, telling them, "We're a serious rock band, we're kind of acting foolish." Again, coming from a guy who'd been known to hurl cans of beer into the audience, passed around bottles of tequila to the crowd, or who often got so drunk on stage he slurred his words, this was saying something. For a producer, they picked Rob Schnapf. He'd worked on Beck's breakthrough single Loser, and right before working with GBV, he produced Elliott Smith's second major label record, Figure 8. Pollard, however, had no idea who he was. "My A&R guy," said Bob, "sent me all these CDs that Rob had produced, and I was really impressed." The aim for the LP was simple. As Pollard put it, "I wanted our music to evolve to the point where it matched the way we sounded live. For a while we had this duality where we made these crazy, quirky, lo-fi records, and then live we were this big, power rock band. It was 2 different things, so eventually these 2 things had to meet. Now I think they finally have." Speaking again of the Beatles, this is basically what they had done, except in reverse. The Beatles began their recording career by basically putting onto tape their live show. Their first record was done in one day, everyone playing in the same room and at the same time. However, over the years, the band began making music which couldn't be reproduced on a live setting, songs like Strawberry Fields Forever and I Am the Walrus. Not having to reproduce their music on stage freed them creatively. Similarly, GBV's early records were collections of spontaneous moments and happy accidents which were crucial to the texture and character of the songs. They could never be replicated live. Now Pollard wanted to do the opposite, capture on record their raucous and loud live show. "I've been telling people for a long time that we're going to make a big, solid, serious rock record," said Bob, "and we finally succeeded." As much as Pollard liked the results, Isolation Drills would mark the last time Bob or the band would use a big-name producer who received sole credit. The LP was recorded once again in New York City, this time at Loho Studios. Loho began life as a rehearsal space before turning into a full-fledged recording studio. Among the groups who have recorded there are Ryan Adams, Joan Jett, Blues Traveler, and Matador label mates Yo La Tengo. The studio operated from 1983 to 2007. It has subsequently been purchased by the Blue Man Group, who uses it for rehearsals and auditions. I have no idea whether Blue Man Group allows drinking in the studio, maybe Blue Hawaiians, but Rob Schnapf, unlike their previous producer, Cars frontman Rick Ocasek, did allow GBV to have a drink or 2 while they were recording, and by all accounts, the sessions went smoothly. The original title of the record was going to be Broadcaster House, after a song from their 1994 EP, Clown Prince of the Menthol Trailer. But Pollard changed the name because he felt it didn't fit the nature and feel of the LP. I looked at the dark nature of the record and how it was kind of personal and everything, so he changed it to Isolation Drills. There's also a song called Isolation Drills, which is the B-side of the Glad Girls single. The title referred to, as he put it, Looking at Your Life. Pollard was doing a lot of that, and it wasn't a comfortable experience. I was going through some inner turmoil in my life, so I needed to get that out. It wasn't comfortable, but it was something I needed to do. The title also referred to the vicious cycle of isolation and the things that cause you to feel isolated in the first place, not to mention how, as people, we deal with and remedy that situation. What the LP boiled down to, according to Pollard, was drinking, fucking, fighting, and loneliness. Pollard said of this period that he was depressed and that, "I just fucking cried all the time." His whole life had been turned upside down. first on a national level by becoming a celebrity, but also at home when his marriage fell apart. He and his wife had been married for 20 years, but Bob was still only 43 years old. That meant he'd been married for almost half his life. He'd met his wife in high school, so it must have been hard to separate himself from that much history, that much knowledge, from that much closeness to another person, no matter how bad things were. And, of course, a separation like that is never limited to just the couple. Family and friends inevitably take sides, plus there are the kids to think about. Pollard's children were pretty old by this point. They were almost adults themselves, but that doesn't necessarily make it any easier. Everyone in the family had their lives and their reality turned inside out. Pollard also said that around this time, fans started to get in his face at shows, challenging his integrity and basically looking for a fight. Meanwhile, others had found his home phone number in Ohio and called his house, telling his wife what an asshole he was. To quote Bob McKenzie from the movie Strange Brew, "My brother and I used to say that drowning in beer was like heaven, but this isn't heaven, this sucks." Pollard must have been asking himself, is this what I've been striving for all these years? Is this what success looks like? The material that wound up on the LP came to Pollard in a short, concentrated period. There would be no ransacking of old tapes or bringing back songs from other projects or LPs. I wrote most of the words for Isolation Drills in one burst. I drove on the last tour we did, all around the country. I was driving across the desert at 90 miles an hour, writing poetry. Then when I got home, I put music to what I'd written. What he was thinking about was his life, the mistakes he'd made, and where he currently found himself. When you're sad and you're having problems with the people that you care about in your life, he said, it does put you in a seriously melancholy mood, but good stuff comes from it. What came from it was one of GBV's best records. Rolling Stone, in a 4-star review, wrote that Isolation Drills makes the case more persuasively than ever that these indie pop godfathers should matter to more than just the loyalists. They also note the more mature subject matter, saying that the songs in Isolation Drills dig behind the savant slacker facade, adding, once slapdash with his talents, Pollard now turns even 99-second fragments like Sister I Need Wine into a fully finished haiku of autumnal longing. And speaking of fall, Stereo Review called the LP Pollard's most personal and touching set of tunes, declaring, the 16 songs on Isolation Drills are as gorgeous as autumn sunsets. Blender magazine struck a similar tone, writing that Pollard sounds grimmer, as if the former grade school teacher suddenly realizes that touring in a van past age 40 isn't as much fun as he expected. And coming from a guy famous for having his own beer cooler on stage, How's My Drinking is one cold-eyed self-critique. Rockpile, giving the record a 5 out of 5 rating, wrote, file this one next to Blood on the Tracks and Who's Next in a bin labeled Personal Pain Bleeds into Masterpiece. Magnet struck a similar tone, opening their review by writing, pain, they say, makes for great art. If this is true, it might explain why Isolation Drills, Guided by Voices' 12th proper album, is one of the band's best. Website Erasing Clouds wrote, the songs are set against a backdrop of universal longing, where everyone feels like things are falling apart and is searching for that one thing that will keep everything together. Songs detail separation, despair, and the crutches used to cover them up. However, before we go too far down the road of talking about longing, loneliness, and despair, we need to remind ourselves that this is Guided by Voices we're talking about. It's not the Smiths or Joy Division, and Robert Pollard is no Nick Drake or Mark Kozelek. Bob had certainly been through some heavy stuff during this period, but I would argue against this being seen as GBV's only serious record. The reason being that there's heavy stuff scattered throughout Bob's songs. Sure, you have to wade through a sea of wizards and elves to find it, but it's there. In fact, Pollard is, I would argue, one of the most deep and self-aware songwriters I've ever heard. It's just that his output is so varied that oftentimes the more sensitive or mature stuff can get lost. Like, take a song like Love-Hate Relationship with the Human Race by Circus Devils. That wouldn't be out of place on any Morrissey record. Or maybe it's all down to the musical backing accompanying his words. It was said that Kurt Vonnegut put bitter coatings on very sweet pills. And I'd say that Pollard does exactly the opposite, writing pure pop melodies that quite often contain lyrical poison. The sleeve for Isolation Drills was once again created by in-house TVT designer Ben Wheelock. The fighter jets on the cover are another in a long line of aerial and flight-related references in GBV's work. And the addition of the rune on the side of one of the planes was a sly nod to the cover of Secret Treaties by Blue Oyster Cult, which featured a drawing of the band standing in front of a fighter jet that had on its tail the Blue Oyster Cult logo. The interior design shows the members of GBV inside a cockpit. The lyrics, on the CD version anyways, are hidden underneath a series of flaps in what adds up to a pretty cool design. All in all, it's a nice package. Getting down to the record track by track, the LP opens with Fair Touching.
Under the iron shop, the farewell ladies wing, always promising no one to crush them.
You can immediately hear how the band's getting back to basics here. Electric guitars, pounding drums, and that's about it. It's probably the most clean and straightforward the band had ever sounded. As Bob said of this record, it's less keyboard-oriented and not quite as much gimmicky this time around. The lyrics, to me anyway, don't add up to much. However, as Pollard said, the last line of the first song goes, "And now at last the song you sing will have meaning." It's maybe some kind of prophetic line. I think that applies to some of the later songs, but not necessarily this one. Second song is Skills Like This.
Reinvented nightly, wake up with skills like this. And do you want me in your head? What's behind your scattered eyesight?
This is another song that sounds massive. The band was indeed finally capturing the hurricane force of their live shows. Personally, I never minded GBV being two bands. I loved the quirky records and I loved the loud concerts. That being said, I certainly get a kick out of just how big they sound on this song. For a band who just come off their longest tour, the lines, "Reinvented nightly, wake up with skills like this," could be seen to represent what Pollard and the guys were going through. Every night they had to get on stage and throw that great party they'd promised us back on Propeller. Of course, that also meant waking up not just with skills, but with hangovers and strangers, and that could be a confusing thing. As Bob said, that line, "I want to reinvent you," is just me asking myself, what do I do now? Third song is Chasing Heather Crazy.
Trailing off the likes so that she likes it when it grows. Sending out a candidate, she's sinking her foes. Picking out the leveling wherever it goes.
This is an absolutely gorgeous and perfect pop song. Everything about it sounds amazing and I never ever get tired of hearing it. Pollard wrote it after TVT didn't hear a single on the batch of songs that Bob turned into the label. Even worse than that, label founder Steve Gottlieb said that Pollard was holding out on him, telling him, "You have more hits in you, send us more stuff." This seems pretty incredible since Pollard was the guy with a crate full of songs. Music just oozed out of him. It's not like there's any shortage of tunes. I guess what Gottlieb meant was more commercial material. Think summer, he told Bob. Think cars and girls. This was not necessarily where Pollard's head was at the time. As we saw from the reviews for Isolation Drills, Bob was thinking autumn, not summer. And anything having to do with cars and girls involved a man, alone in a car, driving away from a girl, and the girl was the man's wife, and she just told him she never wanted to see him again. So it's totally to Pollard's credit that, despite the pressure under which this song was produced, it's a really wonderful and amazing song. However, as poppy as it is, there are some clues in the lyrics as to Bob's emotional state. The girls Pollard invites you to visit, perhaps related to the glad girls found later on the record who only want to get you high, are stumbling around. Plus the world is crumbling down. It's all really not as fun as it seems. Plus there are these lines. Staring out from otherworldly windows painted red. Doesn't have to listen to the voices in your head. That's a different lie. Do you remember what was said? That bit about lies and trying to get one's own facts straight shows the extent of Pollard's confusion at the time. He was living almost a double life, and keeping it all straight, or in focus, was challenging. "We tour all the time," he said. "It's hard on everything. You get the sense that you don't live anywhere. You're almost homeless. It takes its toll on the relationships in your life." And then there's that detail of the otherworldly windows that are painted red. The color red has long symbolized love and passion, but also blood and fire. And, of course, red, or rather scarlet, was the color of the A that adulteress Hester Prynne had to shamefully wear in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Pollard admitted that it was infidelity on his part that broke up his marriage, all of which gives added depth to what Bob dashed off as a mere pop song. Pollard ended up liking this song so much, he included it as one of his 10 favorite GBV songs for an article in Spin magazine in 2004. The next song is Frostman.
Frostman says the summer needs to wait for you. Frostman says the winter.
As if Pollard just couldn't help himself, this is a short, somewhat rambling, lo-fi song that doesn't match anything else on the LP. A longer version, clocking in at 2 minutes and 40 seconds, was the B-side of a Pollard solo single in 2008 as part of the Happy Jack Rock Records singles series. The longer version is a really nice song, but this one feels to me just like a snippet. If it was smashed up against a bunch of other shorter songs, maybe it would fit. But coming as it does, after 3 fleshed out and really good songs, it kind of sabotages the flow. Next up is Twilight Campfire.
Twilight campfire, you build your fires into an open room. You want us to feel better on these darker trails with lights revealing.
Called the Luminous Folk Rock Hymn by Rolling Stone, this is another song that goes back to GBV's REM-influenced past and proves that the band can handle more than just power chords. Showing that you sometimes can look too hard at Pollard's titles or lyrics, he said, "The title means nothing. My friend said to me, 'I got a title, Twilight Campfire.' I go, 'That's fucking great, man.'" He's also said that it's his favorite song on the record. Most of the lyrics read like his usual surreal poetry. "Sunspot soldier, you come from another day. Accept no pay. You want us all to feel better, all for longing causes, racing minds and lengthy pauses, all who must soon shed their veils and wipe their eyes." Musically, it does have a sense of yearning about it, and when Pollard longs to see your twilight eyes, it takes me back to the swooning second half of Over the Neptune, Meshkir Fox. Anyway, it's just a really strong song. The next track is Sister, I Need Wine.
Sister, I need wine for color in my skin and darkness for my eyes, but I can see the light burn.
After the straightforward rock songs and one throwaway, this is a nice and welcome track. The guitar sound was achieved by all 4 guitarists, Pollard, Gillard, Farley, and Tobias, playing the same guitar part simultaneously, crowded around a single microphone. The reason was because Bob wanted a lot of room sound. It's a great effect, especially when some really subtle strings come in. The lyrics finally get at some of the darkness that had only been hinted at in earlier songs. Pollard saying he needs alcohol, not just for a good time, but to give him and his life color. The next lines, "But I can see the light burn through, still it is the night brings me to you," take the song to a whole other level. Light, which we'll soon see again in Glad Girls, is a universal literary symbol. It stands for the divine or spiritual. Not to mention it's the source of knowledge and goodness. Its opposite is, of course, darkness, something that Pollard hints at in the following line about the night that brings me to you. He's writing about temptation and the ancient struggle between light and dark. If you consider that the sister Bob's referring to might be a nun, the discussion takes on religious overtones as well. The song ends with Pollard proclaiming that he's going to drink the truth and shed not one tear. He's come to grips with what he's forfeiting, and he's declared what he's losing in exchange for the escape to be worth it. Next up is Want One? Any vibe created by Sister I Need Wine is promptly squashed with this silly sort of meathead rocker that puts me in the mind of 80s metal bands like Van Halen. The only interesting thing about the song is that it has whistling. A throwaway at under 2 minutes, we're getting close to the end of side 1. Second to last song is The Enemy.
Look me straight, now blame it on loneliness. Who knows?
The song starts with a lo-fi snippet name-checking the original title for the LP, Broadcaster House, before going to another heavy rock song. The drums and the guitar sound huge here. There's even what sounds like some backwards guitar at the very end. While I find most of the lyrics to be impressionistic or cryptic, the final lines are truly haunting. secrets bleeding to untold families, lovers in flight over the gravesite. We become statues in a 10-acre garden. The idea of turning to stone and standing in a huge expanse is a wonderful if depressing metaphor for the distance we can sometimes create between ourselves and the people we love. Also, the phrase everlasting big kick makes an appearance in the song. Remember that this was going to be the name of a 6-song solo EP around the time of Sandbox. It was listed on the Gotham City Music insert but never materialized. Last song on side 1 is Unspirited.
Even when you're lifted by the light, having something gifted, ask them why. Never give it all up, never try. All our hearts are breaking, unspirited.
This is the most musically varied song on the first side, incorporating some synth strings in addition to some great guitar work from Gillard and solid as usual drumming from McPherson. Paul had said the song's about how he felt at the time. Things were going on in my life where I kind of thought I was losing my shit a little bit. I felt like I was unspirited. The way to deal with it was just to become numb and not give a fuck about anything. But there was another element to the song, his son, Brian, who was around 20 when Pollard wrote the song. He's a man now, said Bob, and he's going to be in this whole fucking mess, the same mess that I'm in. But he's much more mature than I am. He's smarter than me. He blows my mind, man. I wish I could be like him. You can see a lot of this in the lyrics, Bob writing, "Everywhere that you go, I'm with you now, and when you lose it all, you'll think of me." Underneath Pollard's admiration of his son is the knowledge that, no matter how mature he is, he's going to get caught up in the heaviness of life. There's just no getting out of it. Marriages end, hearts get broken, children get left behind. And I think Bob's asking for a little understanding and forgiveness here, writing, "When you take the fall, you'll drink to me," meaning when Brian realizes how hard it is to navigate true adulthood, he'll look back with understanding on some of the choices his dad made. There's just no getting out of it. You can't escape living life. You can try to have lessons that teach you what pitfalls to avoid, but those, as Pollard writes, encouraging his kid to be a rebel make you lame or the same as everyone else. And who wants that? No. The only way to gain wisdom is over time and through experiences. As Booth Tarkington wrote, "At 21 or 22, so many things appear solid and permanent and terrible, which 40 sees are nothing but disappearing miasma. 40 can't tell 20 about this. That's the pity of it. 20 can only find out by getting to be 40. It's a great way to end the first side. Side 2 kicks off with Glad Girls.
Hey, glad girls, I only wanna get you high. Hey, glad girls, I only wanna get you high.
What can you say except this is one of the band's best and most fun songs ever? It's incredibly catchy and only takes about half a second to draw you in. That might be because the same as Can't Buy Me Love, it opens with the chorus. Website Medialoper calls this perhaps the most joyous-sounding song Robert Pollard has ever recorded. And yet, even in this jubilant song, which seems on its surface positive and like a celebration, after all, the word glad is right there in the title, even here we find the dark undercurrent that runs through the rest of the record. Pollard writes, "There will be no coronation, there will be no flowers flowing," as well as, "There will be no graduation, there will be no trumpets blowing." It reminds me of a passage from The Crack-Up by F. Scott Fitzgerald. "There would be no badges of pride, no medals after all." Pollard, once so celebrated and heralded for his talent, was seeing that maybe all of this wasn't going to add up to much, not to mention things certainly weren't turning out the way he thought they would, or the way he wanted. Bob again references darkness and light, writing, "With the sinking of the sun, I've come to greet you." It's almost the return of the vampire on Titus. And, of course, there's the line, "The light that passes through me." I mentioned before the various ideas around the symbolic significance of light. The song even contains the idea of redemption, noting that good and bad men all around, some of which are lost, while others have found the light. That goes right back to the 18th century Christian hymn, Amazing Grace. In fact, Bob said the songs and isolation drills were all about sin and being out there in the absence of everything. We all might be guided by voices, but it's sure as hell hard to be guided by God. The song was immediately picked by the label as the record's first single. The band also made a video for the song which holds up really well and complements the song. I had a really nice email exchange with the video's director, and I'll post that to the Facebook page. Second song on the second side is Run Wild.
Think of a no parking zone. Where armored cars keep the secret.
While I'm not a fan of the way the verses sound here, that palm muted guitar style reminds me too much of bad heavy metal. The chorus absolutely soars. Whereas Pollard had once admonished his fans to just motor away, he now invites us to leave your things in the street and run wild. His voice sounds amazing and it's just a joy to listen to. Website Media Lopers says, the last minute of the song is pure catharsis, and I totally agree. That being said, there's still a hint of melancholy even here. No matter where you run to or how you do it, you're going to end up somewhere, and your problems will still exist when you get there. Basically, you can run wild, but you can't run away. Third song on side 2 is Pivotal Film.
Pivotal film, showing clumps of rubber.
Pollard said the inspiration for this song was the English glam band T-Rex, and that the results were exactly what he heard in his head. In fact, he declared, "I think that's the best rock song that we've ever done." It's certainly heavy. That's not my favorite mode of the band, but you can't deny just what a great guitarist Doug Gillard is. The song ends with the lines, "It's cold in the morning where scenesters exit into thin air." This could be seen as referencing the band's overnight success and the ensuing backlash. Long touted as the next big thing, the band had to wonder what happened to all those early scenesters who had supported them. To quote the Breeders, "You loved me then, do you love me now?" Next up is How's My Drinking?
How's my drinking? I don't care about being sober.
Bobs said that this song was a response to a really nasty article in the Dayton Daily News that came after one of the band's famously drunken shows, one that had Pollard stumbling around by the end. Pollard felt crucified by the piece and promptly rejected any warnings or advice by the writer by simply shrugging whatever and writing this song, which he equated to be basically 1-800-KISS-MY-ASS. It is, of course, another in a long line of GBV songs that addresses not only alcohol and drinking, but Bob's own attitude and feelings toward it. Pollard here proclaims, "I don't care about being sober." He's basically telling us to leave him the fuck alone when it comes to drinking. And it's funny that this record has some comparisons to Blood on the Tracks, since one of the saddest lines on that record, to me, is Dylan's delusional promise, "I can change, I swear." Whereas Bob here stubbornly refuses any sort of self-reflection or altered behavior, declaring flatly, "I won't change." Musically, it's a nice song. It has a woozy sort of lurching feel, and Pollard delivers his vocal as if he'd indeed just had a few beers. His harmonizing towards the end is particularly nice. It's the musical equivalent of a nice buzz. The next song is The Brides of Hit Glass.
I don't come around, never come to let her know I got a life of my own. You know I hate to be around her. But she's like
This is probably the most obvious song on the record in terms of referring to what was happening in Pollard's life at the time he made the LP. I mentioned Morrissey before. The lyrics here read very much like his in that they don't really sound or scan like lyrics. The melody is created wholly by the singer rather than be led by the music. The opening lines seem to refer to Pollard's double life of touring and never really fitting in anywhere. "I don't come around, never call or let her know, I got a life of my own." Not to mention the exasperation that comes from being in a dysfunctional relationship, Pollard writing, "You know I hate to be around her when she's like that." Later he adds to this writing, "Just to be around her, just to feel bad." But it's more than just his marriage that's falling apart. Bob's whole notion of himself and the success of his band is being challenged. He writes, "You know it just won't last. To be on top of your own world, with no guardrails to cling to, you fall so very fast." But even though there's a lot of sadness here, there's also hope. Pollard writing, "There's a better road ahead of me." Of course, he then adds, "I just don't know how to make it there." He's not offering any easy fixes. He knows it's not going to be simple. Second to last song on the LP is Fine to See You.
it was sure fine
Musically, this slow song is interesting because it really doesn't have a discernible structure, it just sort of unwinds. The lyrics again reference how low Pollard was feeling at the time, stating, "There is nowhere to go but up." Also, one of the painful side products of divorce is that it's so public. What begins as a private breaking apart between two people all of a sudden spills out to family members, coworkers, and neighbors, something Bob acknowledges here with the line, "All of our friends are thinking about us." Elvis Costello and a haunting song called "This House is Empty Now" dug even deeper, writing, "All of our friends must choose who they will favor, who they will lose." Final song on the record is "Privately."
In the midst of this effort, courageous tongues are bitter.
This is a really nice song and the perfect way to end the record. The same as the preceding couple of songs, it's a ballad laden with strings. The muscle and the power chords from the opening couple of songs has been left behind. The lyrics are a plea for privacy, Pollard wanting to keep bitter and contagious words a secret. He writes, "Don't post them for broadcast, keep them private and away." Of course, it's sort of ironic for Bob to ask for this, since he's making the request in the very public form of a song that's going to be heard by tens of thousands of people. The ending, with Bob repeating "privately" as the song fades out, is one of the best GBV LP endings ever. Okay, that's it for the show. Next time, I'll be looking at LP number 13, 2002's Universal Truths and Cycles, which marked the band's return to Matador Records. But don't forget that next week, I'll launch a bonus episode, a conversation with Adam Shore, the man who signed GBV to TVT and worked with them during their time on the label. Until then, subscribe to the show, leave a review, and God bless the Monument Club.
Diss on the sexless, the new drunk child.